Hello, this is The Briefing. I'm Samantha Simmons. Our top stories. The EU publishes a draft of the Brexit Treaty. It could spark a major row with Britain over a possible hard border in Ireland. A blow to Team Trump as the president's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner has his White House security clearance downgraded. And Indians pay their last respects to Hollywood idol Sridevi Kapoor ahead of today's funeral. Australia recalls more than 2 million cars amid worries over faulty airbags, which have been linked to more than 20 deaths worldwide. A very warm welcome to the programme, briefing you on all you need to know in global news, business and sport. So the world's first plastic-free shopping aisle has been unveiled today in the Netherlands. Is this the start of the plastic-free revolution? Are you embracing the change or hanging on to your plastic bags? You can be part of the conversation as ever. Tell us what you think. Use the hashtag BBC The Briefing. Now, the row between Britain and the European Union over whether there'll be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic is set to intensify today. The EU will publish a draft of the Brexit Withdrawal Treaty, setting out in legally binding text the proposed terms of the UK's departure. The document is expected to say that Northern Ireland will have to follow the rules of the EU's single market if other solutions can't be agreed to avoid a hard border with the Irish Republic. Our Europe editor Katja Adler reports from Brussels.
This document is about the European Commission putting into legally binding text agreements that have so far been reached between the two sides. So remember those divorce issues, citizens' rights, the so-called Brexit bill and the Irish border, and also the transition agreement. That's what will be in this 120-page document. And when it goes in black and white like this, it'll be very interesting to see to what extent the UK government and the European Commission really are on the same page. And when it comes to issues where no final agreement was reached, such as over political hot potatoes like the future role of the European Court of Justice or the Irish border, well then we will hear from the Commission what its fallback position is. And when it comes to Northern Ireland, that's controversially keeping it inside a customs union with the EU and in part of the single market to safeguard, says the Commission, the Good Friday Agreement. Now this is likely to cause an uproar in the UK tomorrow, inside and outside government circles, but we must remember this is a draft legal text. It will still be discussed and amended by the other 27 EU countries and will then be passed to the UK government for negotiation, and I'm sure they'll have a lot to say about it.
Katja Adler, there are plenty more on this throughout the day, and coming up on the briefing, also the latest analysis and features on Brexit on the BBC website, where you'll find a guide in 300 words and details of the proposed repeal bill for transferring legal powers to Westminster. That's all at bbc.com/news. Now, one of President Trump's top advisors, Jared Kushner, has had his White House security clearance downgraded. Mr. Kushner, who is married to President Trump's daughter Ivanka, had access to the president's daily brief. That's a secret intelligence report. He'll now be unable to view many sensitive documents, as our North America correspondent Peter Bowes reports.
Rarely heard but often seen by the president's side, Jared Kushner has been part of the president's inner circle since he entered the White House. He's been operating on interim clearance only, pending the results of a background check, which still hasn't been completed after 13 months. During this time, Mr. Kushner's had access to the president's daily briefing, which is a top-secret intelligence report. But that's going to stop. It comes as the White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, attempts to impose greater discipline on its employees and access to sensitive information. The issue came to a head earlier this month when it emerged that a senior advisor to the president was also operating with interim clearance despite allegations of domestic abuse. Jared Kushner, who's married to Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka, played a key role in his father-in-law's election campaign. During the past year, he's been closely involved with developing foreign policy for the Trump administration, focusing on the Middle East and Mexico. According to his spokesperson, the new clearance policy will not affect Mr. Kushner's ability to continue to do the very important work he's been assigned by the president. But the change in status for Mr. Trump's son-in-law means he will be sidelined from White House meetings at the highest level. With Jared Kushner also embroiled in the ongoing investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election, his background check may be far from complete. Peter Bowes, BBC News.
Let's brief you on some of the other stories making the news now. And a leaked United Nations report says North Korea has been shipping supplies to Syria that could be used in the manufacture of chemical weapons. The report by UN experts, seen by several newspapers, says North Korean technicians have also been seen working at weapons facilities inside Syria. Australia has announced a compulsory recall of more than 2 million cars because of concerns over defective airbags. The vehicles include Toyota, Mazda, Ford and BMW cars which contain Takata airbags. The faulty airbags have been linked to more than 20 deaths worldwide and are thought to have been fitted in 100 million vehicles. Several newspapers in Slovakia have printed the last article by an investigative journalist who was shot dead while examining claims that businessmen with links to the Italian mafia were siphoning off EU funds. Jan Kuciak was murdered along with his fiancée. The Prime Minister is amongst many to have appealed for information relating to the murder. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem has reopened 3 days after Christian leaders closed it indefinitely in protest at plans to tax church properties in the city. The mayor of Jerusalem suspended the tax plans on Tuesday after the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said there would be negotiations to try to resolve the dispute. The funeral of Bollywood superstar Sridevi is taking place after police closed the investigation into her death in Dubai. An autopsy ruled the 54-year-old had drowned in a bath after losing consciousness. She was one of India's best-known film stars, appearing in around 300 movies. Well, crowds have gathered outside her home in Mumbai to pay their last respects. Let's get the latest from Mumbai and the BBC's Samir Hashmi, who is outside the family home. And the funeral now just hours away, we think.
Right. Actually, her body was transferred from the residence to this hall, the sports complex behind us, because it's a much bigger space over here. The body was brought here about an hour back. And now there are fans who are entering the sports complex to pay their last respect. There's a huge queue which goes down the road. These fans started gathering in the morning, and the gates were open just about 15 minutes back, and now there's a huge line. The cops are trying to maintain security and make sure that the crowd is under control. Now, the body will be kept here for the next 2 hours, after which it will be taken to the cremation center, which is about 4 or 5 kilometers away from here. It will be taken on a truck where her body will be laid on top so that people can pay their last respect even during that route who cannot make it to this place. But there is a huge crowd, and the cops are having a tough time to manage them because they didn't anticipate such a huge crowd, but there's tight security here. And it's not only the crowd, a lot of people even from the Bollywood industry are now entering this complex to pay their last respect. Sridevi was a big name not only in Bollywood but also in the southern part of India, where she acted in different film industries in the 1970s and then the 80s before she moved to Bollywood. So she's not a big name only in Bollywood but across India, and that's why a lot of stars are also expected to flow in from different parts of India to pay their last respect as the final journey for Sridevi starts today.
Samir Hashmi, for now, thank you. Kenya's decision to ban the manufacture, sale and use of plastic bags last year was celebrated globally and seen as a major step towards the reduction of plastic-related pollution in the country. The ban is seen as one of the toughest in the world. 6 months on, the BBC's Mercy Juma has been to see how the ban has been taking effect and whether the benefits are now being felt.
A game of cat and mouse. 6 months ago, Kenya banned the use of most plastic bags. Now the National Environment Management Authority, NEMA, is hunting down those who break the law.
We have information that these papers are coming from outside Kenya, mainly Uganda, Tanzania, Somali, and we are trying to follow the lead. In fact, some of the ones that we are finding with the vegetable vendors have a label that it's a product from Uganda, and we are trying to pursue many strategies so that these papers can stop coming in.
The ban has pushed plastic bags onto the black market, and the government is trying to stop the trade. Retailers left with unused plastic bags were asked to declare their stock and make plans to dispose of them, but few did. 6 months ago, what you could see in market stores across Kenya were plastic bags that are usually given to customers free of charge by the vendors. Today, each one of them has stocked on reusable bags that usually come at an extra cost to the buyer.
This is what I use at the moment. I have been going
Many homes have already adjusted to life without plastic bags. The reusable bags are now a necessity. In the place of flat bags, plastic containers are now used for food storage.
The containers are taking a lot of space compared to the plastic bags. And the food that I store in the containers is very little, because if you see the size of the container, that is the only thing I can put there. Maybe I can use it, not even enough for one. I have to remove like 2 containers to fit my family. So the container, despite the fact that containers are big, they're taking lesser food than the way the plastic bags used to be. So I have to look for a bigger fridge that I can put everything, and I'm comfortable with it.
Several other African countries have outlawed plastic bags, including Rwanda, Mauritania and Eritrea. But Kenya's ban is seen as one of the toughest in the world. Anyone caught with a plastic bag can be fined up to $500. Manufacturers can be fined up to $40,000. Since the ban took effect, NEMA has arrested around 150 people. Sam Barat is the Chief of Advocacy at United Nations Environment Programme.
We need to see the whole of East Africa move together as a bloc on this issue. So if you have a ban in Kenya and then no ban in Uganda, then it's possible for plastic to leak across. But I think what we've seen in the past 6 months is huge progress, which Kenya should be very proud of. They've taken incredible leadership, and they've built a global reputation for really caring deeply about the environment, and it's opening up new conversations about what do we do about plastic bottles.
This is the 3rd time officials have tried to cut down on the use of plastic bags in Kenya. Previous attempts were never enforced. Environmentalists are hopeful that this ban will lead to larger measures in reducing pollution in Kenya and beyond. Mercy Juma, BBC News, Nairobi.
Well, on the day that a supermarket chain in the Netherlands has opened the first aisle selling plastic-free food, we're asking if you embrace the plastic-free revolution. Have you given up your plastic bags? Get in touch with us here on The Briefing. Use the hashtag BBC The Briefing, and I'll read out some of your comments a little later on. Also coming up on the programme, the silent soldiers connecting new generations with the past, marking a century since the end of the First World War. The Briefing, our headlines. President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner has had his White House security clearance downgraded. He now won't have access to many sensitive documents. The EU is set to publish a draft of the Brexit treaty. It could stoke tensions with Britain over a possible hard border in Ireland. Well, let's stay with that now. Joining me in the studio is Professor Elaine Fahy, reader in European law at City University of London. Welcome to you. Thanks very much for braving the snow. The beast from the east is well and truly here. Let's talk about this issue of Northern Ireland, because it's very much the focus for the British government today. Claims that Brussels is actually making a land grab. What's your assessment of what's happening?
Well, it's a very interesting state of affairs now. We have legal text to try to put meat on the agreement of the joint report of December 2017. All of a sudden now we see a big question about will Northern Ireland remain in the EU customs union, and can this idea of full regulatory alignment between the north and south of Ireland actually be put into legal text? And what's your assessment? I mean, can it? What's going to happen? Because there's still so much to try and sort out with this really thorny issue. It's become a real stumbling block, hasn't it? It has indeed, as we've seen from the comments of the Foreign Secretary overnight, that there's a huge question about the practicalities of the enforcement issue. Is it actually possible to have no hard border? We don't see any technical solutions proposed by the UK. And the idea of full regulatory alignment is an enormous legal commitment. So how to do this without also threatening the single market will be the key thing on the EU negotiators' minds. Let's talk about the law. And the EU wants to hold Britain to judgment in the European Court of Justice following Brexit. Obviously, Britain doesn't want that to happen. Where do the negotiations go from there on this issue? Well, certainly as regards the withdrawal agreement, we see that the EU negotiators are very much clear that the legal text is unambiguous, that there has to be a role for the Court of Justice to enforce EU law in the transition period. Certainly there has to be a specific role while EU law applies. Going forward, there's quite a lot of governance issues under negotiation, and a role for the court seems very likely if there's so much EU law as part of the agreement. Whether or not lots of businesses and companies and so on will be happy for all these matters to go to arbitration, like in so many other agreements, will be very difficult after 40-odd years of membership.
Yeah, how much of this document is a negotiating gambit and how much is actually going to translate into legal terms, do you think?
Well, I think we're going to see a much more concrete legal solution to what has been agreed, but still it does appear that a huge amount of the legal text will still be fluid and subject to negotiations. It seems very unlikely that questions such as the borders, such as constitutional integrity of the UK and so on, can be resolved here and now.
Yeah, meanwhile, trade. We still don't know what's going to happen with trade. We're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister in a couple of days' time more on this. But as time ticks away, it's almost unbelievable, but there isn't more more to discuss on this issue.
Well, there's huge uncertainty over this, and the UK's position seems to consistently be to want to leave the customs union despite calls for business and industry otherwise. And we see that the EU negotiating position is very clear in this, that it's going to be very difficult to have anything close to a close partnership in the absence of respect for the single market and the customs union itself.
OK, Professor Elaine Fahy, really good to see you this morning. Thanks for coming in. Thank you. Here is our briefing on some of the key events happening later. The European Court of Justice will decide whether the UK is able to exclude a Polish national working in Britain receiving employee rights. The Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School will reopen 2 weeks after 17 people were killed in a shooting in Florida. And President Putin meets Russian Olympians at the Kremlin after their performance under a neutral flag in South Korea was overshadowed by doping scandals. Now, this year will mark 100 years since the end of the First World War. Remembrance events will take place around the world, but organisers face a challenge of connecting new generations to those who lost their lives a century ago. Silhouettes representing fallen soldiers will appear around the UK later this year. It's been inspired by the success of another striking remembrance project from 2014, as our correspondent Robert Hall reports.
The Tower of London, 2014. A wave of scarlet flowing around the ancient walls. Every one of nearly 900,000 ceramic poppies representing a British or colonial serviceman who died in the 4-year conflict. The installation was called Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red. It made a real connection with the public. An estimated 5 million people came here, and many of them bought a poppy as their own tribute to the fallen.
For many of us, the only real links with past conflicts can be found in our cemeteries or on our war memorials. Names from so long ago that it's very difficult for today's generations to make a connection. But what if these men could return to their cities, towns and villages?
This is Penshurst in Kent. 51 of the men from this tiny village who volunteered to fight in the First World War never came home. And yet, here they sit, ghostly figures in the pews, a powerful physical presence.
It's about actually bringing them back into the community, how they lived as well as how they died.
Martin Barrode believes this installation can inspire other communities across the UK.
This is about physically trying to get them back into the village psyche. So that when the school children come in here and they see the 50 names sitting on the pews, they can identify with these people. And when you can see where they lived, and they lived just up the hill there, or they were over there, or they were in the choir, you can really identify with this.
Villagers here have been fascinated by the idea of taking the lost off the memorials. Now the government has agreed to help fund more installations like this one. But other figures have sprung up today, linking past with present. As the Armistice centenary approaches, There But Not There wants us to remember in different ways, and in doing so, raise funds to help those who've been scarred by more recent conflicts. In Kent, veterans have helped to create an army of Tommies, which, like the poppies at the Tower, will be available to all of us.
The importance of the Tommy project is huge to me, because my family are quite a lot of military in there. My granddad and great uncle were in the First World War in the Somme and Verdun, and I always think of them when I'm making them.
in places of worship, in schools, in public buildings, in fact, wherever people gather to remember, the past can become more real.
There's something I think very fitting that this should come at the end of 4 years. It brings it back almost to the homely and the local, and that seems to work very well.
Robert Hall, BBC News, Kent.
Now it's time to get all the latest from the BBC Sports Centre. Now we are talking plastic today. That's our talking point, with the Netherlands opening their first supermarket with a shopping aisle without any plastic. Is the plastic-free revolution well underway? And are you embracing the change or hanging on to your plastic bags for dear life? Let us know your thoughts. We've had these tweets in so far. Ian M. Calvert says, funny how many councils, trading standards and environmental health teams stop shops selling and restricting sales of loose food. Are we now realising that old-style markets and shops are the best way to shop? That's certainly what I remember growing up, my mum coming home with brown paper bags full of fruit and vegetables. Lion Sarath Babu says that's the much-needed one. When this is implemented all over, I know it's real tough, but not impossible. It would lead to a better and a greener environment. Let us know your thoughts. Use the hashtag BBC The Briefing. Stay with us. We've got all the business news coming up. Conditions after temperatures as low as -10 overnight. Well, the cold weather has already caused major disruption, but forecasters say the worst is yet to come, with warnings in place until the weekend. Here's our correspondent John Donaldson with more.
The so-called beast from the east has already left much of Britain under a blanket of snow. This is Kent, which has received some of the worst of the weather so far. On the ground, it's been a much less pretty picture for drivers, with police reporting scores of accidents across the country. In Lincolnshire, 3 people were killed in a crash on the A15 near Baston. Yorkshire and the North East, this was Teesside yesterday, have seen some of the heaviest snowfall. With more expected today, many schools are likely to stay closed.
When I was younger, snow was a lot thicker and we still managed to get to school.
I think it's the teachers that can't get in. I think that's the problem in this area because of the outlying villages that the teachers come from.
For Britain's homeless, this is in central London, it was another tough night. Temperatures down to -10 in some parts and feeling much colder in the wind. The elderly too are vulnerable. In Hull, extra staff at Meals on Wheels services have been brought in to deliver hot food.
I can't get out to get meals and things, and so it's just wonderful. The only complaint I've got is they never bring you a drop of brandy.
And over the next few days that might be needed. Forecasters say they expect no let-up in the freezing weather until at least the weekend. John Donaldson, BBC News.
Coming up at 6 o'clock on Breakfast, Dan Walker and Louise Minchin will have all the day's news, business and sports. Stay with us. This is the briefing from BBC News. The latest headlines. The EU is set to publish a draft of the Brexit Treaty. It's likely to stoke tensions with Britain over a possible hard border in Ireland. President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner has had his White House security clearance downgraded. He now won't have access to many sensitive documents. Time to look at all the stories that are making the headlines in media across the world, and we begin with The Telegraph and the UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who has suggested in a letter to the Prime Minister Theresa May that Northern Ireland may have to accept enhanced border checks after Brexit. The Arab News leads with US envoy to the UN Nikki Haley, who is threatening to take action against Iran after Russia vetoed a UN security resolution condemning Tehran's support for Yemen's Houthi rebels. The New York Times says Saudi Arabia's world dominance over oil production is waning. The kingdom's position is being challenged by a production boom in American shale fields and the rise of natural gas. The Times asks if diesel owners have had their day after cities in Germany were given the green light to ban older diesel cars. The move comes as the country tackles increasing pollution levels. And The Guardian carries a warning the Earth could be heading for a climate catastrophe. The paper says an alarming heat wave in the sunless winter Arctic is causing blizzards in Europe and forcing scientists to reconsider even their most pessimistic forecasts of climate change. So with me this morning is Jonathan Charles, who's Managing Director of the Communications Department of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome to
Samantha,
you.
hello,
Very good morning.
morning.
Braving the snowy conditions out there.
Yes, I have some
well to
sympathy
get
with
in.
that Guardian story in the papers this morning.
We will talk a bit more about that in a moment. Let's start with the Daily Telegraph, though. And this is the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, raising the prospect of a hard border in Ireland. Is he rowing back, or is he stating the obvious?
I think, again, what they're trying to do, Samantha, is it's still square the circle. You know, this impossible circle that the British government is attempting to square, and Boris Johnson is playing into this. This is this whole issue of they don't want to go for membership of the or a customs union, depending on whether you want the definite or indefinite article ahead of that, and they're still scrabbling around for things that will make this work. And yesterday, you know, we had this letter which is picked up here in the Daily Telegraph and other newspapers, this Boris Johnson letter which suggests there's some sort of electronic solution, so you have a hard border between Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland, part of the UK. But the bottom line is, as we're going to hear from the European Commission today, when they bring out their latest document on these negotiations, that is just not acceptable to the government in the Republic of Ireland. It's not acceptable to the European Commission. This idea of having a hard border there, you know, it may be something that Boris is trying to put forward because he knows it's important to keep the Conservative Party's allies on board, the DUP party of Northern Ireland. They need them for the government, for the majority, and that's one reason why they're doing this. But to the European Commission, the idea of having a hard border between North and South Ireland, that is just not acceptable. And I think, again, squaring this circle at some stage, and Michel Barnier from the European Commission is making this clearer again, the British government have got to come forward with what he would regard as realistic negotiating positions. When they see this in Brussels, and I know and I hear from people in Brussels, they just don't regard this as realistic.
Playing into all of this is the peace process, of course,
yes.
And we're going to hear later on today from John Major, former Prime Minister here, about the fact that all of this could undermine the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, I think you've got to remember the fragility of Northern Ireland. You know, to people of my generation, people who were journalists of my generation and spent time in Northern Ireland as I did in the 1980s, it's not that long ago. And you have to remember that although Ireland has come a long way in terms of healing some of the elements of the fractures between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, they are still there. And I think there is a worry that if you don't keep this European but Union-based, in effect, peace process going, because without the fact that there didn't have to be any borders between North and South, it would have been very difficult to reach this sort of agreement. If you put borders back, yes, undoubtedly, you're making a fragile situation in Northern Ireland, a fragile peace, more fragile.
OK, let's move on to the Arab news now. And the US and Russia trade barbs over Iran. And this is about what's really been happening at the United Nations. But obviously, this has got geopolitical consequences, what's happening.
This is about what's going on the ground as well. So the Arab news is making the point that Iran has been helping the rebels in Yemen in this proxy war that has been taking place, really, between Iran backing the rebels in Yemen and Saudi Arabia backing the government. But I think, you know, that you're seeing here the tensions that are going on in many different ways. You've got tensions between the US and Russia on many different issues. You've got tensions between the US and Iran on many different issues. And I don't think you should just see this about Yemen. I think this is also a proxy for another battle which is going on, which of course is over Syria, where Iran has been helping President Assad, along with the Russians helping President Assad, and the Americans opposing all of that. So I think this is a story which is that America is becoming increasingly uncomfortable about Iran's role in several countries in that very, again, fragility we've just been talking about in Northern Ireland, very fragile region. And worries as well that what that might mean, because we've seen in Iran, with Iran in recent weeks in Syria, these tensions with Israel over the Israel says that Iran is shipping weapons through Syria into Lebanon. You know, yet another country involved in this, and Iran and Lebanon have always had this this issue, and Iran's always been involved in Lebanon on one side or another. So I think what we're seeing here is, you know, the tension is rising and an attempt to rein Iran in, and the Americans being very upset that Russia is not helping with that. In fact, so you've got many different countries in a very complex diplomatic situation.
Well, the diplomatic situation is one side of the story. Here in the New York Times, they're looking at the, I guess, trade relationships, aren't they? Their front page headline here, Saudi's looking for friends. This is all about oil as Saudi Arabia basically loses its dominance.
Well, Saudi, of course, was always regarded as the swing producer in oil. It was the one that set the prices, because when it decided it wanted to cut back on oil production, it just turned off the taps a bit and the price went up. When it wanted to earn more money, it opened the taps for oil, and it was able to make money and set the oil price that way. But Saudi, of course, has lost its dominance to the United States. Saudi no longer needs to sell its oil, the Saudi Arabians, to the Americans. Americans got plenty of their own with the shale revolution. And America is now the swing producer. The higher the oil price, the more shale production comes online. When the oil price is low, it goes out. So Saudi Arabia is busy looking around, as this article in the New York Times says, for friends. And it's looking to China, for example, where it needs to sell more oil, and the Chinese do need oil. But Saudi Arabia has a big problem. All oil producers have a big problem, and that is that the world is moving away from oil. Yeah, you know, you've got situations in many countries now where electricity production is, you know, 30 or 40%, and on some days more than 50% from electricity produced by sustainable sources, from wind, from solar. And at the same time, we've got the gas revolution. A lot of gas, which is regarded as slightly cleaner fuel than oil, is online as well. So Saudi Arabia needs the money from oil, but it's becoming increasingly hard to sell oil.
OK, let's have a look at the story here in the Times business page. German cities win the right to ban diesel, something that Angela Merkel's actually kind of not really that happy about. It's been quite controversial. The Germans do love their cars, don't they?
They do, yeah, and there are 15 million diesel cars in Germany, according to this story in the Times. We had this court decision by the German court saying cities can get rid of older diesels. The difficulty with that is it's very hard for motorists who've invested. They've been encouraged to invest in diesels, because for a long time, it's almost unbelievable now, diesel was regarded as the clean alternative to petrol.
I was one of those who got suckered.
Well, there you are, you see. And now we see these nitrogen oxide pollutants, you know, they're the things that are causing various health issues. We've had all these scandals over car companies trying to alter, particularly Volkswagen, trying to alter diesel emissions measurement. And so what's going to happen? I think the worry with this is, if you're a diesel owner or indeed a diesel car manufacturer, that what starts in Germany could easily ripple out across other European cities outside Germany. There will be other cities and other environmental campaigning groups who say, we want to take the same measure, we want cities to ban older diesels. I think the day of diesel, you know, clearly is on its way.
Absolutely. We've been talking about the weather, the beast from the east, as it's been labelled. The Guardian front page here sort of tries to explain it, where it's coming from and why. I mean, there's not necessarily a causal link between what's happening in the Arctic, but there's a suggestion that there might be.
Well, you know, I read this article with a lot of fascination, not just because I, like you, trekked through the snow today of the ungritted streets of London, but also because about 2 weeks ago, actually, there was a story in the Times, in the weather section, which said something strange is happening in the polar vortex, and this is going to come to haunt us in a few weeks' time, and it did. So what the Guardian is saying is that we've had unprecedented, almost warming in the Arctic over the past few days, where on some days it's been warmer in the Arctic than it has in London or Zurich, thousands of miles to the south. And as a result of warming in the Arctic, it is expelling the freezing cold weather, which we're seeing now in large parts of northern Europe, and some bits of southern Europe as well, which we're seeing here in London. And this should be really worrying to us, because this could be, if this carries on, where we keep getting these episodes of a warmer Arctic in winter, we will keep getting these blizzards that we're seeing in northern Europe. That's what the piece is saying. And I think that's, you know, clearly something is going on in the polar vortex. The question is, and I think it's clearly a battle between the scientists, you can see it in the Guardian article, is it global warming or is it some irregularly occurring natural phenomenon? But either way, there seems to be a connection. So we don't want a warmer Arctic, otherwise we're going to be freezing here. With all the implications, by the way, the Guardian raises for food production and all sorts of other issues for living in, you know, if we keep... Someone said this is a return to normal winter. but there's nothing normal
No,
about this if it turns
absolutely.
out to be connected to the polar vortex.
Let's do this last story now. And this is the world's first plastic-free supermarket unveiled in the Netherlands. More than 700 products are going to be available without any plastic packaging. Now, I find this story really interesting because everything you find in the supermarket, everything is covered in plastic. When we were growing up, our parents would come home with the groceries in brown paper bags. Is that what we're going back to?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, it's plastic fantastic or not so fantastic, isn't it? This supermarket, you know, should actually set a trend. I would welcome, I'm sure we all would, not being deluged by mountains of plastic, because it's becoming an issue, you know, particularly in the United Kingdom, where many councils now want to cut back on rubbish collections. They don't want weekly rubbish collections. So if you've got mountains of plastic, when you get it home, what do you do with it all?
I know.
But on the other hand, we're not really prepared for this change yet. I think it's clearly coming, but it's going to be a process.
Jonathan, great to see you. Thanks very much for coming in. Do stay with us. Thanks very much for watching the briefing from me, Samantha Simmons, and the rest of the team. For now, it's goodbye.
Hello there. The coldest